Walking into his dining room, the most amazing man that one never thought that one would meet, was just sitting there and greeting us. And when he stood up to say hello, he was so tall. I couldn't believe the kind of scale of him. And he was so smiley and grandfatherly and really welcoming.
He was humble and down to earth, he was chatty and friendly, and he sat there calmly signing his works, each one with a big signature, and he chatted to us about many world figures. You had to pinch yourself that you were really there and sitting with Nelson Mandela at his dining table, but it felt very natural and very much like he was a kind of normal grandfather figure.
And he was talking about how important colour is to him, because he believed that colour would help the viewer to transcend the awfulness of a place and to see everything in a much more warm and positive light, and that actually speaks volumes about him. We saw drying on the sofas some of the handprints that he had done that morning, and his hand had been painted black, and prints had been done with the idea that they were looking for a print that had very good love lines and lifelines that would have shown his marriages, his children, and the state of his life, and had good finger and thumb prints because that was relevant.
So it was quite remarkable when it actually came out with this shape so closely resembling the continent of Africa. And it is just such a striking piece.
So we've had a range of people with very deeply felt experiences, and especially when they read the texts that Mr. Mandela wrote that go with each image. I think that in some ways those are more poignant and extremely moving.
People really want to share in the history of them, I think, and are just inspired by this great man who has done these pieces that tell the story of his life, really.
Well, thank you very much, Google, for having us here. It's such a privilege to come to an amazing space and offices that we would never normally come to. So the story started for us. I was an art publisher, and my big coup had been working with Prince Charles. I wrote to him and suggested that his watercolours could be made into lithograph to raise money for his charities. They did very, very well. It was called the publishing coup of the decade, and we raised £4 million for his charities, for his charitable foundation. I was at a meeting at St James's Palace, and various people were talking about how come they'd been so successful. I said, it's very simple. There are only 3 people in the world who, if they did some artwork, would sell as well. And I said it would be Prince Charles, who at the time was married to Diana and things were very golden. The Pope, John Paul II, that everybody adored. I don't think he ever painted. And Nelson Mandela. And then, unbelievably, I was in New York in February 2002. New York was, at the time, really miserable. The Twin Towers had gone, and there was just a profound sense of loss. We also had in our family a tragedy. My son Sebastian died aged 18 a few months earlier. And I didn't really want to be in New York at all. And there at an art show, I met a man who had approached Nelson Mandela in exactly the same way as I'd approached Prince Charles, and said, if you do some drawings, you know, even if they're not amazing, they could raise a lot of money for your charities. And he had been inspired actually by seeing the drawings of John Lennon, which are a bit variable. Anyway, he managed to pull off this, and but in South Africa it's not known as an art. It's not a centre of art. There's only 3 places: London, Paris, New York, the big centres of art at that time. So he asked me if I would handle Nelson Mandela's work, and I was Well, I was a bit flabbergasted by it. The first ones, as Mr. Mandela said, were black, and they were quite strong, very strong political pieces, actually. Two of them we brought here today, and there's a little strip of the smaller versions of them. But they were called the Struggle series, and they got photographs of his hands, so the clenched fist, its struggle, and then imprisonment, 2 hands in handcuffs, and then broken free, and then unity, and then a big hand and a little hand, and then a wonderful handwritten motivation about the hands. And they were lovely, but then I thought, the average buyer that we had at that time in Tunbridge Wells or whatever would probably find it quite hard to put in their houses. And anyway, we launched them, but we asked if Mr. Mandela would do some with colour. And apparently he just loved the idea, didn't he? And he said, well, I'm best known for Robben Island. And it was his idea to go back to Robben Island. Nobody wanted to suggest it to him. He would have some photographs taken, and you can see some of the photographs here. And from those photographs, he sat at home in his dining room, which you just saw doing these drawings. And he said, if I've got any talent at all, it's in the deep recesses of a very old mind. And he asked for an art teacher. And a young girl who just finished training as an art teacher was asked if she would help an elderly man do some drawings. And she wasn't told who it was. She didn't really think twice about it. She just arrived with a whole, some baskets of her paints and so on. And as she was going along that road in Houghton, she said, oh, doesn't Nelson Mandela live along here? And soon she was whisked into his house, and there she was in that dining room. And she realised who her pupil was going to be. And she started him off with some paints, and he was just utterly hopeless. And then she thought, no, let's go back to basics and some drawings. Would start with some drawings, and they used stubby crayons and that. And she soon realised that, given the right materials, he was very keen to do this. So that's really how that aspect of it started. Anyway, they did amazingly well, and we were asked to go and meet him. Laura had just finished university, and she'd only been working with me for 6 months.
Yeah.
And do you want to take up the story where you got on the plane at Heathrow?
Well, we were so excited because we were upgraded to first class on Virgin, and that was enough for us, really. But we made it very comfortably to South Africa, and stayed in the hotel actually in Johannesburg, where Nelson Mandela had written his autobiography, which was quite fitting. And were picked up in the morning and driven to his home by the driver. And I mean, as we said on the video, we walked into his dining room, and there he was sitting at his dining table with his neck brace on for support and comfort. And he sat for 4 hours talking to us about world figures, Princess Diana, Prince Charles, Margaret Thatcher, who he described as motherly. He calmly signed each piece. We passed him pencils as one needed sharpening. We'd pass him another. And he just told us how much he loved creating these images, and really couldn't believe that the public was so interested in them. At the time we were with him, we'd launched Series 1, which was 6 pieces, 5 drawings and 1 written motivation, which are over there, and include the window, which is this imaginary view of his what his cell looked onto on Robben Island, which of course it didn't look onto Table Mountain at all. It looked onto a grey courtyard, which is pictured in another piece. But this was his imaginary view of freedom. Actually, I think that piece really encapsulates what he was trying to do. It was this grey prison island, and he managed to put these bright colours in and see beyond what maybe other prisoners might be able to see, to freedom and to his country. And so, yeah, really our morning with him was spent talking about the pieces and signing the works, which he did far more patiently than I think most artists would when confronted with a pile of lithographs to sign. And yeah, he said, when I am allowed to retire, I'd like to become a full-time artist. So, which unfortunately never happened, but
he started off by clutching Laura's arm and saying if she put on some weight, he would find a husband for her from amongst his grandsons. And Laura said, actually, I've got a nice boyfriend in London. So it was, and then I think he must have thought you were about 12 because he asked me if I'd like a cup of coffee and you if you'd like a milkshake.
He did.
And said, have we got some milkshake in the house for Laura? And then Laura said to him, and this is not a business meeting that you could ever imagine having in other circumstances with a world leader. She said, Mr. Mandela, I've got a new Sony camcorder. Do you mind if I film you signing these? And his lawyer was in the room, and he turned to his lawyer, and he's a lawyer himself anyway, but they both said yes. And that piece of video has been absolutely pivotal to us in not just launching, justifying, it's been a very important historical document of him being there, and it was just done in the most innocent and
really grainy footage you saw on there.
Yes, and it goes on, and we put, because his accent was quite hard to understand, and also he was deaf in both ears, and so he had a hearing aid in both ears. And I found with deaf people before, the easiest way, especially in his presence above all, is to let them do the talking, because there are always so many interesting insights. So he talked a great deal. He spoke about Diana, whom he credited with alerting him to the nature and scale of the AIDS disaster. He said that when he was on Robben Island, he read of a court case in South Africa where one of the defendants said, I've got AIDS. And the whole courtroom cleared, including the judge, and everybody ran out because they were so terrified that they would it would be so contagious. And he said to us, and I thought that was the case as well. But then when we saw Diana, a British princess, holding the hand and talking closely to people with AIDS, then I started to realise that this was not the way that it had been portrayed. And then he started to really engage with the problem of AIDS. So that was one little insight. And then I asked him about his trip to Brixton. And it was quite amusing because he said I went there with Prince Charles. He's a very popular fella. He said, when I went there, he was mobbed. People came out from all over. I couldn't believe the number of people that wanted to see him. And then you said...
I think it was for you, Mr. Mandela.
Yeah, and then he praised the way the horses, he couldn't believe the way that the horses controlled the crowd in Brixton. So that was really a lovely little insight. And then, as Laura said, snippets about other people he met, especially Mrs. Thatcher, whom he really thought was wonderful. But the one that really I loved was when he said that he was invited to Buckingham Palace, and he met the Queen, and his words to her, Elizabeth, I know you from your stamps. And she replied, Nelson, I know you from your T-shirts. And, they obviously had a very, very warm relationship, and she was very accommodating. His daughter has been staying with us in the last few weeks. In fact, there's a wonderful article about her in the Telegraph today. The online version is better than the newspaper one. But she said how much the Queen liked him, and that nobody else called her Elizabeth. Only Nelson Mandela, and they accommodated him very well. So that was some of the background to that day. And actually, very nicely, he invited us to something he was doing that evening, which is at the Apartheid Museum. And we went to see that, which is quite shocking, maybe one of the most interesting museums in the world. And he spoke at a book launch of Iqbal Mir. So that was lovely. So after that was in the December. The lithographs were selling like hotcakes, and we'd organised an event for the world's press to see the lithographs for themselves and write about them on Robben Island at an amazing dinner. And we all went out by boat, and Mr. Mandela came out in a helicopter. And at this dinner, he spoke about his art and how much he loved doing it. And then also at the time that we saw him a few weeks earlier, he became very exercised about the impending war with Iraq. He bored into me about why we were siding with the Americans and not the French. And so I've got a very rusty degree in politics, would you believe? And I sort of wheeled out a few of the bits that I thought appropriate, probably not at all. But anyway, it was a very difficult time for him. And you could see from the time that we were with him how very vexed he became about political issues.
Well, exactly, and how, the political landscape was, in his heart, in his soul. And he was clearly very involved in the South African politics as well. When we were with him and throughout his whole life. And the freedom of his country was something that he wanted to show us in these artworks, and was, his really life's work, I think. Does anyone have any questions for us, though? I hope everyone will have a good look at all the artworks and read the handwritten motivations, because they are really powerful and quotable and give such an insight into what these works meant to him.
We believe that they are of immense historical significance, because few people of the calibre of Nelson Mandela have actually done drawings that relate to their lives and struggle. I mean, Churchill's paintings are now famous. At the time that Churchill died, nobody wanted anything to do with them. Now starting price is £1 million for them. But they don't actually relate to the struggle that he had and to his life. Just they're pretty pictures of places that meant something to him. This is really unique. Gandhi didn't do this. It's really unique in telling the story of part of his life, and we would like to see these originals going to really good homes where they'll be viewed by many people internationally.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anna and Laura. This is really, it's wonderful. Thank you for sharing this with us today.
Thank you.
And I just wanted to remind everybody that there are cardboard viewers over there on the table, so that you can see, these are from Robben Island Museum cardboard tour of different areas of the prison, as well as other stories that have been curated by the Robben Island Museum. And I think that as you obviously spend time looking at the artwork, that you take a moment to use the opportunity to see the spaces themselves, the original sites, and compare, because I think the point that you were making about color is so important, and how he's sort of bringing to life or vivifying what are some very grim places and areas of the prison. So seeing his interpretation of it is all the more powerful when you can compare it to the actual locations. So without further ado, thank you all, and please enjoy the space.